To begin, the hallmark of your work on behalf of Israel is the sentence, "If Israel fails, the West fails." And I'm wondering if you could explain what you mean by this. What does it mean that if Israel fails, the West fails?
Well, I personally consider that Israel is a Western country. It's not a Middle Eastern country. It's a Western country in the Middle East. And we consider that Israel is a democracy as our democracies, as a democracy as US or Spain or France or UK, normal democracy. And the Israelis have the right to live in peace, not living under threats, not living under the pressure of the rockets, or under the threats of terror, or under the threats of nuclear bomb. But they have the right to live in peace, and they have the right to establish the future of all the Israelis in the same terms that the rest of democracies in the world. Peacefully, looking in prosperity, looking at democratic development, and looking in a better future for its people. And we consider that Israel is in the forefront on the most important civilizational struggle that exists today in the world. And Israel is in the forefront defending the classic Western values: freedom, tolerance, pluralism, rule of law, equality, democracy. And if Israel suffers under the attacks of its enemies, this is a problem for us. And I consider personally that the problems of the suffer Israel there are as well our problems. If the Western values is wiped in Israel, because Israel is wiped, we are, with our Western civilization, lose, maybe forever. And this is why I consider that Israel is a vital part of the Western world. If Israel suffers problems, my moral, ethical, social, and democratic and political responsibility is trying to help Israelis to improve the situation, to confront the situation, into keeping this position that is vital and decisive for the interests of the Western world.
Rafael Bardahi has mentioned to me that you spend up to 3/4 of your time now connected on issues related to Israel. Can you explain why you devote so much of your time as ex-Prime Minister of Spain to the welfare of another country?
In my times as President of Government, I changed some policies relating with the Middle East in Spain, and expressed a position extremely favorable to Israel and to government on the moment. I recall very well that at that time, 1986, 1987, the Prime Minister in Israel, in this moment, Bibi Netanyahu, he had only 2 persons with this possible to establish dialogue in Europe. Was Tony Blair, my friend Tony Blair, and myself. And then we can choose. We can do a lot of things, no? But I defend my positions was under the responsibility of the government. But then we created 4 years ago a new organization that we call Friend of Israel Initiative. Friend of Israel Initiative, that Rafael Bardahi is the director of Friend of Israel Initiative. I am the president. We created this organization 4 years ago, and this organization, it is one. He has a very special characteristics. It's a non-Jewish organization. to become a member of the board of this organization, it's almost indispensable to be no Jews. Because we are not Jews. There is no sense that a non-Jews founded a Jewish organization. It is not a Jewish organization. That the key question is that we share the ideas and the convictions that I expressed recently, that Israel is an essential part of the Western world. And we're trying to avoid two serious problems that some people are converted in a problem for Israel. One is all the temptations to delegitimize Israel, and second is all the temptation to isolate Israel. Israel needed friends, and we must to establish a more close relations among non-Jewish people and Jewish people, among Christian people and Jewish people, among organizations that express the same strategical convictions that Israel and the State of Israel. Our commitment is with this idea, and our commitment is with this consideration, a strategic consideration in favor of the State of Israel, the right to exist to the State of Israel in the same conditions that our nations. It is not an easy task, because it's very different, as you know very well, Daniel, it's not the same to speaking about in favor of Israel in US than in Europe. I know that the work is very different to speaking in favor of Israel in some campuses in the US than in other parts of the US, but in Europe it's more complicated. In Europe, if you keep in a position publicly in favor of Israel, you will be marked immediately and suffer some consequences in the daily life, because it's more problematic defending this. But for us, for the people as the former presidents, historians, writers, journalists, people different corners in the world, we express our conviction. If we decided for this question, for this threat, for these changes, we must to say publicly, we are friends of Israel. And we express publicly our commitment with the State of Israel, not with singular decisions of a government in Israel, but on the State of Israel and the idea of a State of Israel. We organize public activities, publish papers, publish op-eds, publish articles, publish our reports and documents. We organize very private initiatives. One of the last is, for instance, to move in with a lot of efforts in the European Parliament and in European institutions to introduce Hezbollah in the European list of terrorist groups. That was a success after 10 years, but finally was a success. Or defend another situation or position in favor of the State of Israel in the United Nations, in Geneva, or in other parts. But this is our commitment with the State of Israel. We can publish a report about the borders of Israel, or present a few weeks ago an important report over the relation between the European Union and Israel. Precisely last week, we celebrated our annual meeting in Jerusalem. And we passed 4 days in Israel, very interesting. We celebrated a meeting with Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, with the Speaker of the Parliament, with the Minister of Defense, with the Minister of Intelligence, with the Director of Mossad, with a lot of social and economic representatives of the Israel life. Why? Because we must to understand all the complexity of this region in this moment. That is really very complex in the current circumstances. No? But understand, I believe, after the Arab Spring, there are three different moments. First moment is disconcert. How happened here? The second moment is to analyze this, and the third moment is to establish conclusions. And now we can establish conclusions. Establish conclusions that affect the evolution of the sunny world, the shared world, the evolution of different countries, the position of Israel, the relation of Israel with other countries, the consequences of the negotiations between Iran and US, the change of the position of the US, the evolution in some countries as Egypt, of Turkey. We must spend a lot of attention in this. I will consider that this part of the world is decisive for our interest, and I spend one part of my time in this area. This organization, they have another characteristic so far, is the bureaucracy of this organization is one. Second, this guy, Rafael, is not part of bureaucracy. It's a part of the convictions and the enthusiasm, and myself as well. This is the characteristic of the organization, and we will continue to defend these ideas and to extend the number of the friends of Israel everywhere in the world. And now, I finish with the answer, but I believe that I have as well the right to ask you. And I have two curiosities, because, for instance, my father was a journalist, but I decided to cross the river to politics, okay? Your father is Sovietologist, but you decide to cross some ground to the Middle East. I would like to ask you why. And then I will be very pleased if I can hear and understand some of your activities in favor of the Middle East Forum and in favor of to understand better these current circumstances in this region.
Okay, well, role reversal. I took up the Middle East in part because, as you said, my father studied Russia. My roommate studied China. I was never terribly interested in Latin America or Africa because they just didn't appeal to me that much. Europe was too familiar. So it left Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And I traveled in the Sahara Desert and decided I wanted to study the nomads of the Sahara Desert. And so the language of the Berbers being obscure and of not much use, I decided to take up Arabic. So at 19, I started on Arabic, and here I am. So a bit random, but it was now 45 years ago. And it has been a fascinating and passionate subject. As for some thoughts, well, first, as far as the forum goes, we really have three activities. Intellectual, what I mentioned before, in that we are attempting to figure out how to win, how to get from here to there. Operational, we have, as Amy mentioned, a number of projects dealing with the campus, with Islamism, with Washington, and so forth, that the protection of those of us who speak about Islam that are operational, that are actually doing things. And finally, we have a philanthropic arm. We have been fortunate to be given a substantial amount of money every year to hand out to allies, including the Friends of Israel Initiative, which we are major supporters of, and I urge you to support. In addition, if I might go back to the original roles, in addition to being a non-Jewish organization and working on behalf of Israel's interests, I think even more important is the fact that you are high level. You as former prime minister, a couple of former presidents from Latin America, and others of high rank, that you have access in a way that most organizations do not. Without telling stories that you shouldn't tell, is there something that you can relate to us, recount to us about your experiences where your access made possible had an important effect in your meetings with high-level people?
I like very much always in my life to working with the best team possible. I hate mediocrity. And this is one of the things because I don't like politics in this moment. Because politics in this moment is the kingdom of the mediocrity in general. But I like to have very good teams with share these ideas, or with the capacity to express brilliant commitments publicly in favor of these questions. For me is absolutely fundamental. And you can establish a task, a job of leadership, but to have these people from Uruguay to Australia, putting on a table the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Australia, Alexander Downer, the former President of Peru, Alejandro Toledo, one is British historian, Andrew Roberts, an Italian philosopher, Marcello Pera, a theologian, American, George Weigel, a people from Germany. The question is, when some people listen to this explanation, the question is, why? And my answer is always, why no? This is, in my view, the right path, a right course. If you and these people can spend our time in this course, we are very happy to do. And if we can use our relations in conversations with governments, private conversations, without public consequences, but that make an effort or establish a more influential position in favor of this interest, I think is a good idea. I live in a country, Spain, that historically lived under domination of Muslim population, Muslim people during 8 centuries. 8 centuries is not a small time in history. This is one of the reasons because radicals, jihadists, and the most extremist people in the Muslim world consider that Spain is a part of the Muslim world and trying as well to recover the Muslim world. But I defend Israel, I do not express, it's an expression of charity. I defend a political interest and a strategical vision. And this is one of the more reasons that express that the interest of Israel is our interest. And now we have suffered pressure and attacks from the part of terrorists, Islamist terrorists. But you can, my concern is our will, our convictions, our capacity to keeping and defending our values. This is my concern. What is capable to do the extremists, I know very well. What is capable to do secessionists, I know very well. That the nationalist is very dangerous, I know very well. But my capacity to keep in positions and to react under threat is my concern. And in this moment, I am concerned because I consider that, in general, the will, the capacity, and the decision to react is very limited, to use a diplomatic expression.
So there is a dearth of leadership in Europe. Where will the future leaders come from, if not the far right?
The problems of leadership in the world today, the weak leaders in the world today, is not only in Europe.
Don't know what you're talking about. No idea what the reference is to.
I cannot put, maybe it's a consequences of different circumstances in politics, no? Maybe the evolution of technological revolution for our democracies, the people with, that decide to spend time in public life is a consequence very, very negative. No? This world, the global world, the technological revolution, it has a lot of advantage, but as well disadvantage. And one of the disadvantages that produce that a lot of people with capacity, enormous capacity to spend some time in public life, renounce of this possibility. Because to be in politics today is really, well, very unpleasant. Why? Because one part of the traditional public rules that forge our democracies are disappearing, without substitution in this moment. And the private life, there is none exist directly. And the combination of both produce that everywhere, and when I say everywhere, say exactly everywhere, the level of politicians in the world declining dramatically. And Europe is an expression of this. Second, if you look in 10 years ago, looking back 10 years ago, we can choose very different circumstances in terms of leadership and some leaderships in Europe. No? And then one of the risks is if you accept traditionally the tyranny of the politically correct, or accept today the daily referendum that exists in the networks that establish what is good, what is bad, what is correct, what is incorrect, and crush and eliminate all the responsibility in the leadership, only the people in the part more extremists of the map are the capacity to take the opportunity to say, hey, I have an explanation for this. And this is a problem for all the democratic people that must establish an explanation of the problems today. No? It is possible to find leaders without this kind of complex? Yes. It is not easy because circumstances don't help us to find these leaders, but we must to encourage good people to spend some part of the life in politics. Because finally politics is essential. Politics is fundamental. If you put in the worst hands of your country the responsibility to govern the country, you will pay horrible consequences in the future. There are in the world several examples of these bad consequences.
Thank you. And with those wise words, I thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much. All the best for your organization, all the best for you. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoy very much.
And
Thank
let
you.
me re-emphasize that Friends of Israel Initiative is looking for support. You see the kind of work that it does. Now, our topic is U.S. foreign policy in the age of Obama, with special reference to the Middle East, but not exclusively the Middle East. Steve is working on this very hard. Now, Obama was elected just 17 months ago with a strong foreign policy approval. Where does he stand now?
There has been a tremendous shift that's gotten very little attention. When he was first elected in 2008 and took office in 2009, he had 3-to-1 foreign policy approval ratings. And as recently as the re-elect in early 2013, he had 2-to-1 approval. But today, his foreign policy is less popular than Obamacare. Look it up. I'm not speaking of polls taken by Republicans or by his adversaries. I'm speaking of the mainline polling organizations. His foreign policy disapproval is now 2-to-1 overall. It is more than 2-to-1 on topics like Syria. It is 2-to-1 on his relations with Russia, his policy toward Russia, his policy toward China, his policy toward Saudi Arabia, his policy toward Iran. It's a remarkable fact that the bottom has collapsed. And on broader issues, for example, is he tough enough to be president? He now has a majority saying he is not tough enough to be president. Offered 3 choices: is he too tough, or just tough enough, or not tough enough? And his domestic disapproval is matched by foreign disapproval. He was the most popular guy in the world a short time ago. But today, he is doubted deeply by the Saudis. He just came back from Saudi Arabia, a not successful visit. His Secretary of Defense was in Japan this week. What week is this? And got a deep anxiety from the Japanese about whether America is strong enough and Obama is strong enough. In NATO, Obama went to Brussels and other places to reassure the European allies in the face of Putin's invasion or his offensive in Crimea, and the Europeans came away their fears unrequited. So there's been very little written about it, but the fact is the bottom has fallen out of public support for his foreign policy.
When did that bottom fall out?
You may remember that he drew a red line in Syria. Then the Syrians called his bluff and used chemical weapons, which was what the red line was about. Assad used chemical weapons in a rather hideous way. And he then went on national television, addressed the American people, and said that he never drew a red line, that it was the world that drew a red line, or the United Nations, or somebody else drew a red line, but he didn't draw a red line, and Kerry said the same thing. Subsequently, he zigged again and said that he was going to use force, but then he astonished his own top aides. He didn't consult his Secretary of State, he didn't consult his Secretary of Defense, his National Security Advisor wasn't in the room. He took a walk in the White House garden with a young man named Dennis McDonough, who's an okay guy, but he's in his early 40s. He's a guy with a BA in Latin American Studies from St. John's University. He is not a person anybody in Washington gave any thought to. We're not speaking here of Kissinger or Brzezinski or Metternich or talking about Dennis McDonough, whose only real virtue is that this guy likes to play basketball with him. And he took a walk with Dennis McDonough and decided to send the decision to Congress instead. Well, I suppose to some people that sounded like not a bad idea. Want Congress to be a partner. But let's look at it with our eyes wide open. This is a Congress that can't pass any legislation. This is a Congress that is completely paralyzed, and he knew it. The decision to send it to Congress was basically a decision to file it in the circular file, as we say, and not to do anything. So all of a sudden, but he got lucky. Putin pulled his irons out of the fire a little bit, save that for another time, but That was the moment that people saw what we really have here, which is not mere incompetence, but a profound lack of understanding of the world, of dealing with adversaries, of working with allies, of the fundamentals of foreign policy.
Are these errors that can be fixed? Or is he doing lasting harm?
I'm more and more worried. If it was merely incompetence, if it was merely that he came to the White House with very little foreign policy experience, yeah, that's not particularly unique for American presidents. As a matter of fact, it's more common than the opposite. We have had a whole series of presidents who, but we had presidents who honored fundamental precepts. He challenges most of those fundamentals, and he is systematically dismantling the architecture of global security that was built in 1945 or after 1945, after the end of World War II. He came to president out of war weariness. My friend Cliff May, our friend Cliff May, wrote an article with a great title, "When the Power Hungry Meet the War Weary." And that's the world we are now looking at. We're looking at a world full of predators who are watching this phenomenon of a president who's filled with illusions of finding common interests with Putin and common interests with the Iranians and common interests with Assad for a while, and with a profound belief in multilateralism. You know, if you remember that just weeks after becoming president, he was instantly awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, which is quite astonishing. But if you actually read what the Nobel Committee gave him the prize for, it was because of his commitment to multilateralism and the United Nations. And more recently, Putin put an op-ed in the New York Times in last September, to reach over the head of the president to the American people. And in his op-ed, he picks up on the same theme. He explains international law and how the use of force by the United States would be a violation of international law. And he lectures Obama on the importance of multilateralism and that use of force has to be authorized by the UN Security Council, which translated into English has to be authorized by me, Putin. And it basically means that Russia and China have a veto over United States foreign policy. And the most fundamental principle that Obama stands for in world affairs is this principle of multilateralism, as the Nobel Committee correctly discerned. And he adds to it these illusions about adversaries. You know, both Obama and Kerry have given a bunch of speeches with a theme that nobody's really noticed either. They keep arguing that our adversaries are not winning. They explained that Putin is going to really regret taking over Crimea because he's not winning. He's being punished by the world community, and he's coming out the loser. He explained that Iran is not winning in Syria. He's not winning. They are not winning, and he uses this a lot. And he believes that what winning means is getting some kind of approval from this little establishmentarian community of multilateralists that he lives in, where these things are not applauded. But the problem that we have is that these are not mere errors of inexperience, that these are not just mistakes that will pass, that he is essentially destroying the credibility of the American deterrent on which security depends in every corner of the world. The reality, the fact is that American power is the foundation of world peace. And all this stuff about understanding with our adversaries is a dreamlike state that he lives in, but it doesn't really exist here on the earth. What brings peace is strength, and he's lost the sight of that.
Let's take a look at a number of countries in the Middle East, if you could just quickly address mistakes that Obama and his administration have made. First, let me try Egypt.
Well, Egypt is really a fascinating case because here we had an ally of 30 years who controlled the Suez Canal, and which is a fundamental strategic interest of the world, and who was the foundation of peace with Israel. Mubarak, whatever was wrong with him, kept peace with Israel, or at least non-war, through a whole series of wars between Israel and other Arab countries and the Palestinians. And whatever was wrong with him, and there were lots of things wrong, that's pretty fundamental. And 6 days after the protests began in Tahrir Square, he called on Mubarak to step down, and not just that, he called on him to bring the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, into the government, and they had been a banned party, and to give them a role. It just takes your breath away. And he had these illusions that because he lived with Muslims in Indonesia and he knew some nice people, that we were going to make friends with this new crowd that came in. Then Morsi came in, a man who profoundly despises the entire Western world, certainly the United States, and let alone Israel. And he increased aid and assistance to Morsi, stepped up deliveries of F-16s to Morsi. Then Morsi was overthrown by the army, thank God I would say. By the way, let's remember that al-Sisi, the head of the armed forces, got twice as many votes for his constitution as Morsi got for his. He got 20 million and Morsi got 10. So while he hasn't yet been elected president, it's fair to say, it isn't the case that this is a little palace coup by a handful of military officers representing no one. They were the largest protests in the history of Egypt against Morsi and in favor of the army. So, but did he join the protesters as he had joined the protesters against Mubarak, our ally? No, he did exactly the opposite. He opposed the protesters, depicted this as the legitimate government of Egypt, and, my favorite, cut off delivery of Apache helicopters to the Egyptian army. Now, you may have been following the story of what's going on in Sinai, where the Egyptian army is facing Al-Qaeda and Hamas and an insurgency that's inimical to another ally, Israel, and is undermining the whole structure of the Egyptian-Israeli peace in Sinai. And they picked that moment to cut off helicopters, which are the main weapon against Al-Qaeda and the others. Again, it takes your breath away. I mean, it's so dumb. They must have had a bad ideas contest in the White House, and this one won.
Saudi Arabia.
In Saudi Arabia, look, Saudi Arabia is not my favorite country either, but we could do a whole lot worse from a global strategic perspective than what we have in Saudi Arabia today. Certainly from Israel's point of view, this is as good as it gets in that bad country. And for the United States too. And what has Obama's policy been with Saudi Arabia? If there's a Shiite uprising in Bahrain, which by the way happens to be the headquarters of the US Fifth Fleet, which is the fleet that maintains the security of the Persian Gulf, and there's an uprising against the Sunni government, the Saudi-allied Sunni government of Bahrain, sponsored by Iran, with Iranian agents all over the place, with the clear intention of taking over Bahrain, throwing the US armed forces off the Arabian Peninsula, Obama supports the protesters in Bahrain. And the message to the Saudis, who by the way sent troops into Bahrain to actually fight for the survival of the Bahraini regime, and he lectures them about how what a violation that is of this UN charter or whatever. And the same in Yemen, and the same in the Saudi Eastern District, where most of a disproportionate share of Saudi Arabia's oil is, but it also happens to be a Shia majority district, which the Iranians have not failed to notice and have every intention of sponsoring insurgencies there. So all around the Saudis, again, I understand that we're not having a love affair in this room with the Saudis, but think strategically for a minute. From a Saudi point of view, all around their periphery, Obama is sponsoring, more or less sponsoring insurgencies against them in alliance with the Iranians. Meanwhile, you didn't ask me about this, but the Iranians in 2009 had an election, the so-called Green Revolution, in which, from all indications, all honest indications, it was the so-called Green Revolution that should have won, Karoubi and especially Mousavi. The regime puts tens of thousands of people in the torture chamber and falsifies the numerical results in ways that are demonstrably false. Sarkozy, president of France, says it's a fraud. Merkel, chancellor of Germany, calls for a recount. All kinds of Europeans, even the Swedes, call it a fraudulent election. And Obama says, we don't want to leave anybody with the false impression we're seeking regime change in Iran, so we'll be silent about this. He refuses to call it a fraud. He refuses to call for a recount. He's the only Western leader, pretty much, who fails to condemn what happened there, all on the theory that this is going to undermine his outreach to the Muslims and his effort to come to an accommodation with the Iranians later on about nuclear weapons, the accommodation we're looking at now, or the effort. So, again, these are mistakes so profound that they can't be ascribed merely to inexperience. They are fundamental misconceptions, a deep inability to understand the difference between an ally and an adversary, a deep inability to understand that conflict is real, incompatible objectives are real. It's not miscommunication. We can communicate with the Iranians just fine, thank you. We know what their motives are. They knew what our motives used to be, and we have a conflict with them, not because we didn't talk to them, but because they're trying to destroy everything that we stand for. That's why.
Well, adversaries are friends you haven't made yet, aren't they? Palestinians.
Well, with the Palestinians, he keeps telling us that Mahmoud Abbas is the last chance for peace. Well, as a general proposition, telling somebody it's the last chance is not a good idea, because you may lose the bet and then you're going to have to come back a few months later and say, oh, we have a whole fresh last chance for peace. But that's just a tactical mistake. The deeper mistake is, I mean, think about it for a minute. He tells us that Mahmoud Abbas is relatively moderate and a lot of the others are extreme, so we better make a deal with Mahmoud Abbas because he'll be gone soon. Let's think about that for just a minute. We make a deal with an old man, he is gone, the ones you were worried about take over, and now you've pulled out and you're facing, pick a name, you know, it answers itself, this argument. But on top of it, the last 12 months have been full of very revealing speeches by Mahmoud Abbas. It's fair to say that, unlike Arafat, he doesn't directly sponsor terror, and that's not a small point, and I think we should concede that point. But very much like Arafat, he has repeatedly said that he won't compromise on core demands, especially the right of return. He said the right of return, he said this on 5 or 6 occasions, this is not one verbal slip. He said the right of return cannot be relinquished by the president of Palestine. I don't have the right to give up the right of return, he said. He said it's an individual right that belongs to each Palestinian, and only each Palestinian can give up the. So why are we negotiating with this guy? What do we get if we? So one could go on about it, but maybe the final thing I'll say about the Palestinians is, last Monday night, Martin Indyk was sitting, he's the principal deputy to Kerry, in the Prime Minister's office. Perhaps some of you visited the Prime Minister's office. You know, they have these glass doors, and you go to the inner sanctum. It's not very fancy, by the way, but it's the seat of power in Israel. Martin Indyk was in the room with the Prime Minister as he was trying to cobble together a coalition of ministers for a policy of restraint on settlements, the release of 400 more prisoners. He was being threatened in the outer office by Danny Danon, a leader of the settler movement, who is also now the head of the Central Committee of the Likud and the head of the right of the Likud in the Knesset. And he was being threatened by Bennett, the head of the Israel Home Party, and he was being... Now, you could have all different opinions about this, but one thing you can't doubt is that he was in front of Indic's eyes preparing to split his constituency in order to keep these peace talks going and to cobble together this package, this kind of odd package that included the release of Jonathan Pollard and so on. And then Mahmoud Abbas announces that he's going to the UN with these 15, membership things. And John Kerry cancels his visit that was supposed to take place 18 hours later for negotiations on Wednesday to come to this agreement to resume the peace, to continue the peace talks. Well, you could be for this, you could be against it, but facts are facts. This is exactly what happened in front of Indic's eyes, and also in front of Kerry's eyes, because he was smack in the middle of it. A week later, he goes before Congress and blames Israel for the breakdown in talks. Why? Because of this theory of even-handedness. This theory of even-handedness, that we never demand anything from the Palestinians because they are the victim here, and so we don't hold them to any kind of standard. And moreover, we don't act as an ally toward Israel in a world in which more or less everybody else is allied with the Palestinians. So if we're neutral, the other side wins, because neutrality is not neutral in its effects. So it's just another one of those decisions so profoundly wrong that you can't call it a mere mistake. It has to be seen as a fundamentally flawed conception of what that policy is about, the Arab-Israeli peace negotiation policy.
Backstory is that Martin Indyk is where he is, thanks to Stephen J. Rosen.
I don't know that that was a compliment.
Don't know that it was either. But he is.
The backstory is that Martin was a student of mine in my professorial days, and I'm the guy who brought him to the United States, initially as my deputy at AIPAC, in a train of events that brought us to where we are. But I would argue in my own defense that while there's lots of things I would disagree with Martin about, I don't think he's the fundamental problem here. I think the fundamental problem is named Barack Obama.
And I would push back and say to you that it's Martin Indyk who came up with the notion that if you can solve the Arab-Israeli dispute, then all the other issues of the region become easier to deal with, and therefore this gets a primacy and a priority that's bizarre. Electricity grids in Jerusalem come before centrifuges spinning in Iran, but let's leave it there. Going back to the president, how would you compare him with the prior Democratic presidents, such as Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton?
Well, Jimmy Carter certainly, to say the least, was not my favorite president. I became a neocon because of Jimmy Carter, because he was so horrifying as president. But in fairness to Jimmy Carter, and I'm sure most people in this room don't rush to be fair to Jimmy Carter, and I don't usually either, but just think about this for a minute. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and let's look at what Jimmy Carter actually did. The first thing he did was to announce he was going to increase the U.S. defense budget in a 5-year plan, 5% a year for a 25% increase in the U.S. defense budget, and he followed up on it. The second thing he did was to announce something called the Carter Doctrine, which was that the U.S. would militarily defend the Persian Gulf against any Soviet incursion there. That had never been, we're used to it today, but that's where it all started. The third thing he did, I should maybe have put this first, is he started arming the Mujahideen, and his national security advisor said that the purpose of arming them, the Mujahideen were the insurgents in Afghanistan, and secretly arming them through Pakistan, and the motive would be to bleed the Soviets dry. And some people have actually attributed the fall of the Soviet Union 12 years later to what followed during the Reagan years, in which Reagan very much continued and accelerated the policy. So I'm not trying to say Jimmy Carter was a gift, exactly the opposite. Now, you may say Carter did it because he had Ronald Reagan nipping at his heels. Reagan had come very close to getting the Republican nomination in '76. He lost to Jerry Ford. Jerry Ford then lost the election, and Jimmy Carter became president. But Reagan had a radio program, if you remember any of this. There's a few old-timers like me in the room. And Reagan was a constant voice. He was the presumptive Republican candidate for '80. So Carter knew that if he showed weakness in this episode, that Reagan would leap on it, and it would cost him in the 1980 election, which indeed it did for other reasons. And what about Bill Clinton? Another guy I have a lot of policy differences with, but relatively speaking, Clinton was a hawk compared to Obama. Let's remember that Obama ran against the Democrats in the year 2008. Most Democrats had voted in favor, including candidate Clinton, Hillary Clinton, of Bush's use of force resolution on Iraq. 2 out of 3 Democrats in the Senate had voted in favor of it. And Obama said he was against it, and what's more, he had an Iraq Withdrawal Act, and Obama ran as a war-weary, left-wing, war protest candidate. Bill Clinton, if you take yourself back to 1992, ran as a so-called New Democrat. He ran against the Democratic left, not as the candidate of the Democratic left. He had been the head of the Democratic Leadership Conference, which was the wing of the Democratic Party or party machinery that existed to fight against the left of the Democratic Party. And Clinton positioned himself as a national security hawk. He actually said that had he been a senator in 91, just prior to the 92 election, he would have voted in favor of George H.W. Bush's use of force resolution. Well, that was a remarkable statement because 80% of Democrats that time had voted against it. So he ran against his own party from the right. What I'm trying to say is, until Obama, every Democrat since 1945 has run as a national security hawk, often under withering fire from the Republicans, saying he's not a true hawk, he's just, he's making it up and not being honest. But they tried to position themselves toward the center by emphasizing their national security credentials. Obama was the first one who did the opposite. He ran the way McGovern ran, who never won an election, and he ran the way other Democrats on the left ran as an anti-war candidate. And you get what you pay for. That's what we got. And he got away with it for a while, but as I said at the outset, he's not getting away with it anymore. His foreign policy is now less popular than Obamacare.
And the Republicans, what might their response be?
Well, what I have to say here as a guest of the Women's Republican Committee is not pleasant. The first problem we have is this unbelievable, huge field of potential candidates among Republicans. So the party doesn't speak with one voice. I recited the story of Ronald Reagan in the run-up to him becoming president. He was the presumptive leader of the party very early on. Today we don't have a presumptive. We have 16 or whatever it is, potential candidates, and they are a cacophony of voices. Secondly, their voice on foreign policy has been muted by all kinds of things. Take a look at the use of force issue on Syria. Some of them said, I'm not going to vote for it because it's too little force. Others said, I'm not going to vote for it because it's Obama, and I don't want anything to do with Obama. Anything he's for, I'm against. Some of them were against it because it's going to drag us into another foreign war. The Republican voice wasn't clear. And that's my main concern, that not only do we have a president who's lost his way, but we have a Republican leadership that's lost its voice. There are exceptions. We have, for example, Marco Rubio, who is articulated at times a fairly clear conception. We have some others also, but it's only a beginning. It's nothing compared to a John McCain, whose entire career was for national strength. It's scary. We need from the Republican leadership a much clearer alternative to this abysmal policy of Obama's that's bringing about the erosion of the structure of world security.
And final question, is there anything that an organization like ours, someone like yourself, can do in this context?
I believe that this is inspired. This organization, you told the story of how you founded this organization at a time when others didn't even think it was needed, because look at how perfect the world now is. And you had the foresight to see that this was to some degree an illusion at the time, but in any case it wouldn't last, and that there needed to be let me use a phrase you didn't use, an alternative conception of the American national interest in the Middle East, to articulate and sustain an alternative conception, to speak clearly about, I was just saying about Republicans, but the same is true of think tanks, not just potshots about this or that mistake, but a broad vision, and one that's understandable to large numbers of people, not only for a couple of experts at Harvard or whatever, but it's something that the attentive public can grasp and have as. And I really want to join Amy in saying it's a privilege to work with you, Daniel, because you have done this your whole career, but also the whole organization. If you look page after page, go to a back issue of the Middle East Quarterly, for example, and you will see so many articles that were steps and steps ahead on specific topics. It's really exciting when you do that. So I think having a think tank like this matters. People sometimes say, well, all that matters is passing legislation in Congress. I worked for AIPAC, as we went over, for decades, and believe me, I do agree that Congress is vital and AIPAC is vital, and as Dory Gold says, AIPAC's the aircraft carrier of the Jewish people. It's true, but Congress is only a part of the picture. A bigger picture is moving the consensus. The American people are ready for a different idea. Let me take 1 second to recite just one or two other points about the American people. Did you know that the American people are opposed to cutting the national defense? That offered the choice, they want to see either no cuts in defense or cuts that are smaller than the cuts in domestic. I'm speaking of mainline polls here. The American people want the U.S. to be the #1 military power in the world. The American people are in favor of all kinds of examples of the use of force that are given to them, such as drone strikes and attacking terrorist camps before they attack us and stuff like this. They are not pacifists. They are not, but they need leadership. They believe contradictory things. It's typical of public opinion that people have opposite beliefs in their mind at the same time. So having a consistent alternative vision of the national interest in the Middle East, as the Middle East Forum does, plays a vital role because ideas matter. It's admittedly not the same as hard results, but ideas matter. And this organization is at the forefront in the war of ideas, and it's a privilege to be part of it.
It's a privilege to be working with you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.